Chapter 11. Return to a Dangerous City. Now I will tell you what happened to me and my mother. The day after Oscar and Emily drove away, a Russian soldier on horseback rode up to the factory. He called out to us, "You are free!" Were we really free? Survivors will tell you that they will never be free from the terrible memories of what they went through, the starvation, torture, humiliation, and murder of many innocent people. Each of us reacted differently to our liberation. Some chose to walk home to Krakow, more than 200 miles away. Others, including my mother and me, decided to wait until the Russians could arrange for a train to take us home. Near the Amalia factory in Brunlitz, my mother and I found a little cottage that had been abandoned by Czech owners. We stayed there for a few days until word reached us that a train was ready to take us to Krakow. At the Brunlitz station, friendly Russian soldiers helped us climb into boxcars. There were maybe 150 of us finally on our way home. The train was not like the terrible one that had brought us to Auschwitz. In this one, the soldiers had kindly provided wooden beds with blankets and food and water. When you get back to Krakow, the soldiers warned us, don't go outside at night. Some Polish people don't want you there, and there could be trouble. After all we had been through, we had hoped that people in Krakow would be sympathetic and welcome us home. That did not happen. Anti-Semitism was still strong in Poland, and we would have to be careful. After 2 days, the train arrived. People at the train station told us there was a refugee agency set up to help us Jews returning to Krakow. We walked to the agency's address, a building that had previously been a school. We were hoping to be assigned a place to live and to find news of our family. The walls of the office were covered with messages on pieces of paper. My name is so-and-so. Do you know anyone from my family? We did not find our names anywhere. No one here was looking for us. Not any of my father's 6 brothers or their wives or children. There's Fiver the library cat. Not any of my grandparents, cousins, aunts, or uncles. Eventually, I found 2 of my 11 cousins who were still alive, as well as my father's sister. No one else from our family survived. A Russian official told us we could stay in a college dormitory that had been converted into a shelter, but my mother didn't want us to live like that anymore, with strangers crowded into one room. First, we wondered if we could move back into our old apartment, so we walked from the station to our street, entered our building, and climbed the stairs. When we got to the apartment, we discovered someone had moved in. He told us he was a lawyer, and because the landlord didn't know if we were ever going to come home, he'd been allowed to rent the apartment from the time we left. We were not surprised to find someone living in our place. We had no hard feelings about it and didn't blame him for moving into our apartment. How was he supposed to know we would survive? The apartment was very much as we had left it in 1941, when we were forced to move into the Krakow ghetto. The same color paint was on the walls, and the same lamps were hanging from the ceiling. The same linoleum covered the floor, and my parents' clothes closet and wooden bench were still there. But we didn't stay long. The apartment was no longer our home. We had to find a new place to live. The fabric, shoes, and vodka given to us by Oscar proved useful. We were able to sell these items, so there was some money for food and rent. Eventually, we found an apartment to rent. Although it wasn't nice, I had to pour hot water onto the mattress to get rid of the bed bugs. But at least it was our own place, and that was a lucky thing. As the Russian soldiers had warned us, many people were not happy about Jews returning to Krakow. On several occasions, they tricked Jews by telling them, "You can sleep here tonight," and then during the night, they murdered them. We stayed in Krakow a month or so, but life there was too dangerous. Every day there were outbursts of anti-Semitism. How strange to return to the place where I'd grown up, a place I had loved. only to realize it would never be the same again. The streets of Krakow were stained with Jewish blood. The Jewish population was all but gone, murdered by the Nazis. Krakow was no longer a place where we could rebuild our lives, and my mother and I looked for somewhere else to go. A girl I had known before the war heard we were back and came to visit. We described for her how uncomfortable we felt in Krakow and how much we wanted to find someplace other to live. Many Jewish survivors have gone to Austria, she said, to live in a displaced persons camp, a DP camp. I hear it's comfortable there and Jews don't have to worry about being attacked. Why not try there? My mother and I agreed that this sounded like a good plan. Just as we were about to leave for the DP camp in Linz, Austria, we had another visitor. This time it was a boy who'd been our neighbor in the Krakow ghetto. "Rena, I have a surprise for you," he said. "Your friend Sonia from the Krakow ghetto is alive, and she and her sister and brother-in-law are living on a farm not far from the DP camp where you're going. I'll take you to her." In the days after the end of the war, camp survivors were allowed to ride trains and buses for free. When at last we arrived in Linz and found our way to the farm, Sonia and I fell into each other's arms and wept like babies. We wept for the murder of her parents. We wept for the murder of my father. We wept for all the innocent Jewish men, women, and children who had been murdered. When we had shed all the tears we could, we fell back into our old ways of talking about everything, from boys and food and laughing like we used to do to chase away the sadness. In Linz, I found a job as a typist and translator for the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the UNRRA, an agency that provided food, shelter, and other necessities to victims of the war. Sonia found a job with the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, HIAS, an organization that provided humanitarian aid and assistance to refugees. We carried some money and swore to never be separated again. In Linz, I also met my future husband. Chapter 12, Marriage and Family. Marriage in America, By July 1945, the American Army had set up offices in Linz for the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, which was responsible for tracking down Nazis who ran away at the end of the war. Anyone who worked for the CIC had the special privilege of shopping at the Army PX, the Post Exchange, which sold hard-to-find food, spices, and other items not available in the public markets. One day, a friend came running to see me and Sonia at the farm. She was excited. "I spent time with some boys working with the CIC," she said. "You have to meet them. They have cans of fruit and milk." Sonia and I were teenagers and a bit mischievous. "Why not?" we answered. And off we went to Linz. Our mutual friend introduced me to a 24-year-old man from Krakow named Marek, who worked for the CIC. He was an educated young man who'd been liberated from the Mauthausen concentration camp. Marek spoke English well, and the Americans were glad to have him work for them as a translator. He looked handsome in his American uniform. We had a lovely dinner, and Marek came back to visit me again the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. In years to come, Marek would tell our children that it was love at first sight, and that he used a lasso to capture me. There was no lasso, but I would agree that it was love at first sight. We married and could not have been happier. The only thing missing was a way to move to America. Sonia had a relative who lived in Massachusetts and who was willing to sponsor Marek and me. That meant the relative was willing to provide a letter saying that, if necessary, he would cover our living expenses in the United States and guarantee that we would not become dependent on charity. Thanks to the letter, Marek and I arrived in America by steamship on November the 19th, 1948. The first thing we did was look for work. Merrick found a job in a leather factory, and I worked as an assistant in a shoe factory. It was not the life I had dreamed of as a girl, but we were alive in America and had nothing to complain about. 6 years later, I was able to send papers from my mother and her new husband, who was also a Holocaust survivor, to come from Europe to America. By then, Merrick and I had 3 children. My mother and her husband found jobs and bought a house. We were all so happy to be a family again. My dear friend Sonia had immigrated to the United States a few months before me. Along with her sister and brother-in-law, I spoke with her about whether we should tell people about our experience, and at first we decided not to. It would be too painful to discuss publicly, and besides, we also knew nobody who wanted to hear such horrible things. Then something happened that made us change our mind. People known as Holocaust deniers were declaring that the Holocaust never happened, and that Jews invented the Holocaust to win people's sympathy. Sonia and I agreed something had to be done about the Holocaust denial. The best thing we could do was to speak about the truth, about what we had personally endured, but we weren't sure how to go about it. Then, in 1979, we met a remarkable woman named Margot. Margot Stern-Strom grew up in Memphis, Tennessee in the 1940s and 50s. Back then, Memphis was segregated, and from the window of her high school, Margot could see a sign in the zoo across the street that said, Thursdays were colored day only. The only day of the week that African Americans were allowed to visit the zoo. Later in life, Margot recounted that during her childhood, people didn't talk about racism, anti-Semitism, or the Holocaust. Discrimination and bigotry were just the way things had always been, and nobody seemed willing to do anything about it. Margot became a teacher and devoted her career to educating young people about injustice. In 1976, she co-founded an organization called Facing History and Ourselves, which today has taught millions of students and teachers about the Holocaust and the causes of prejudice. Facing History and Ourselves has grown into an international network of more than 40,000 educators who reach 4 million students in more than 200 countries every year. My dear friend Sonia was the first one to work with Margot in classrooms. By then, Sonia was married and had 3 wonderful children, yet she found time to meet with students, tell them of her experiences, and answer their questions about the Holocaust. I remember the first time Margot invited me to speak to a group of students. Their teacher was nervous because one of the parents had found out about my talk and told Margot, I don't want my children to learn about the Holocaust. Who could blame her? What sensitive parent wants her child to learn about starvation and murder? This parent felt better when Margot explained that my message was not so much of atrocities as about how everyone, including young people, can make a difference in the world. Sonia died from cancer in 2010, and her death was a terrible loss for me. It was, and it still is. What kind of world is this, I wondered, where someone can survive the Holocaust and then die of cancer? Is there no justice at all? Then I remembered something important about Sonia that helped me out of my depression. She was never bitter, despite all she'd been through. Remembering that didn't erase the sadness of losing her, but it helped me to recall that she and I always shared the same philosophy. Life, however long or short, is a blessing. When I remember that, Sonia is still with me.